Hello, BookTube. I thought I'd do another installment in Boldly Govember, which is a one of the easiest flippin' read-alongs you'll ever do. It was made by Matt at Paperback Junkie, where, as you can tell from the title, it's meant to celebrate Star Trek fiction in the month of November. And in order to qualify, all you have to do is read a Star Trek novel. Any Star Trek novel. Any show, any franchise, any year, at all. And then, boom, you're part of Boldly Govember. And I, of course, am doing that, but I'm doing a bit more. I'm using Boldly Govember as an excuse to reread a lot of Star Trek and bore you by talking about it. And last time we did this, we talked about two old anthologies from the 1970s, Star Trek The New Voyages and Star Trek The New Voyages 2, both of which were edited by a team called Sonder Marshak and Myrna Culbreth. Edited by them, heavily rewritten in large part, in many, many instances by them, and also with stories by them. That in the Procrustean Petard, the short story that I mentioned by them, is really good. It's one of the highlights of the volume in which it appears. It's got a very fan-fiction-y flavor to it. It's a kind of prose that you will never read in Star Trek fiction now. Because keep in mind, at this point, Star Trek fiction was still sort of up for grabs. It was not taken seriously by the corporation that owned the publishing arm that printed the books. No one was really paying attention. And so Star Trek fiction could get away with being a lot like Star Trek fan fiction that had existed for a decade and that had passed around in dot matrix fanzines and had sequels and multiple sequels and was the talk of what at the time we called conventions. It wasn't really anything. It was a group of people getting together to drink cheap, warm beer and talk about Star Trek. And everybody had a bug to write. And people did. People wrote everything you could possibly think of, extrapolating from those original first 3 seasons of Star Trek. I have read so much of that fan fiction, so much of it, including a gigantic verse epic of the founding of the Gorn Empire. from one Star Trek episode in which Kirk fights the lizard captain of an alien race's starship, the Gorn. And somebody wrote a huge Homeric-style verse epic of the founding of their empire, reminding us that in order for the Gorns to have starships and whatnot, they had to have had technicians, they had to have had scientific breakthroughs, they had to have had a history. It wasn't just a monster that Kirk fought, and so on and so forth. A million variations. Now, I admit, in those first 3 seasons of the original Star Trek, there were some characters who elicited more of that kind of fan fiction than others. No one elicited more than Kirk and Spock, and quite a bit of that was sadomasochistic in the extreme. But there were also other characters. There were lots of characters who evoked more of that fan fiction than other characters did. For instance, in the first 3 seasons of Star Trek, you have the character of Lazarus. You won't, unless you're a diehard Star Trek fan, remember who he was, and he evoked virtually no fan fiction. Whereas, on the other hand, you have someone like Miranda Jones, a blind human telepath who studied telepathy on Vulcan. People took that backstory and ran with it. Harcourt Fenton Mudd had many, many funny stories told about his adventures before he encountered the crew of the Enterprise. And also, Vulcan, the planet Vulcan, T'Pau, T'Pring. These were great characters. Although they appeared only 1 episode, they were great characters, and they were given tons and tons of backstory, tons and tons of extra adventures. And another character who elicited that kind of reaction, in the extreme, is someone we never even learned her name. She was a Romulan commander. And keep in mind, this is back in the 1960s. And she didn't just command a starship like Jim Kirk does. She commanded a fleet of starships. She was a commander of a wing of Romulan war vessels. She had a loyal second-in-command, and her ships obeyed her orders. I mean, we'd seen very strong women. Miranda Jones is a perfect example, but also the Lan of Troyes, a warrior woman, easily a physical match for anyone, and plenty of others. Ariel Shaw, a great courtroom lawyer. With no apologies, these characters never had any apologies. They never had any emotional breakdowns. They never did anything like that. It was just presented as was, and of course, greatest of them all, Uhura. On the bridge. Absolutely essential. Trading sass with Spock and Kirk and getting away with it because she's indispensable. Incredible thing to see and inspiring to a lot of people, not just women either. But this Romulan commander was a special thing for a lot of people. She was attracted to Mr. Spock, and she tells him her true name. We never hear it, but he does, and he says it's beautiful. And she is capable, stern and capable. She loses in the end. It's the episode that introduces the cloaking device and that introduces what it looks like and has all sorts of fun. It's called the Enterprise Incident. It's a really good episode. It has its flaws, but it's a really good episode. But I think even as a first-time viewer, the thing they will remember is her as a character. And fans took off with her. They loved her. They wrote a lot of stories about her. Sandra Marshak and Marilyn Culbreth were towering figures in that fan writing community. They were great writing teachers, great writing encouragers. The fire that they put into people who, for Star Trek The New Voyages 1 and 2, those anthologies that we saw last time, the fire that they put into writers to contribute to those volumes was real. There were many, many people back in the 1970s who would have said to you, if you'd asked them, I would never have thought that I could polish this thing in my desk drawer into something that could be read in a book by everybody for money. I would never have thought that in a million years if it weren't for these two women. And one other woman who they credit liberally, but who never actually stepped to the fore the way they did. But one way or another, naturally, they wanted to write their own books of Star Trek fiction. And that's what we're doing today. They did write a handful of Star Trek books. And those books, naturally, unavoidably, are very, very reminiscent of the fan fiction that had been percolating since the show went off the air. Very reminiscent of that. You can't help it. I don't think they could have written anything else. They certainly couldn't have written the button-down corporate prose that we'll be seeing later in Boldly Govember. They couldn't have done it. Their prose is breathless. They are extremely fond of one-sentence paragraphs. They're extremely fond of callback language, the characters referring not just to events, but also to the way each other refers to events, to the point where if you're not following along closely, you'll get 2/3 of the way into one of their novels and you won't have any idea what the characters are talking about, because everything that every character says becomes a verbal referent for every other thing that a character is going to say. And also they're very fond of characters having mind meld linked with each other over long distances, and you kind of forget who's linked to who and who's aware of whose thoughts and whatnot. But none of that really matters, because boy oh boy can they tell a story. Boy oh boy can they tell a story. And the story that we're talking about today is my favorite of all of the ones that they did. It's The Price of the Phoenix. And it opens with Jim Kirk dead. Very first page. Jim Kirk beaming up to the Enterprise, his body being brought up to the Enterprise by Mr. Spock. Spock and Kirk go to a weird planet. It's got all sorts of dioramas and living villages of native cultures of various planets. It's ruled and overseen by a gigantic alien man named Omni, who they don't trust. He seems right away to be smirking at them. He's obviously a genius on many fronts. The planet is protected by a force field that even Mr. Scott can't figure out, and that is completely impenetrable. And while Kirk and Spock are touring some of these native dioramas with real people in them, there's a fire in a house, and it looks like there are innocent people involved who might be in danger, and of course Jim Kirk does exactly what you'd think he would. He plunges in, and it collapses on top of him. And what is recovered from that house are the charred remains of his body, which Spock has beamed up to the Enterprise. But Spock is furious and grief-stricken. He believes that it was a setup. And on this planet, also talking with Omni about this force shield, about long-range transporters that make no sound, about what Omni's plans are for the galaxy at large, is our old friend, the Romulan Commander, who is intrigued by Omni and who doesn't know what's going on. She thinks that Kirk is dead. Turns out that it's more complex than that. Omni reveals that through a combination of the standard transporter technology, which disassembles you into your subatomic particles, beams you through an energy beam to a distant location, and then reassembles those particles in a transporter buffer. Omni has taken that technology and he has paired it with the replicator technology that creates food. You program a replicator and it produces the right kind of food for you to eat, or a hydrospanner, or whatever, through just manipulation of matter. Omni has combined those two, plus an extremely sophisticated device for reading personalities, personal memories, engrams, and whatnot, the whole totality of your mind. Which he can only read, his machines can only read it during the absolute extremist moment when you think you're going to die. When all of that is fired up to 100 times its normal intensity. He has created a device that combines all of that technology to make a perfect duplicate of a person. A dead person. He beats death. He creates functional immortality. Only he's selling it to the highest bidder. He makes it clear, he makes it known to Mr. Spock and the Romulan Commander that Jim Kirk's still alive. But he was made by Omni's technology and he's Omni's property. And you can imagine how the book explodes from there. And we see this character, this new Kirk, who, to protect himself emotionally, in addition to, just for accuracy's sake, Mr. Spock and everybody else starts referring to as James. We see scenes between James and Omni that our main heroes on board the Enterprise and in the Romulan Warfleet don't see. And one of those scenes is a perfect callback to the fan fiction, to currents in the fan fiction of the day that Sandra Marshak and Myrna Calbreth knew so well. Omni is not human. He is Vulcanoid. He's obviously from an offshoot of the Vulcan species. So not only is he gigantic, he towers physically over other people, but he's also inhumanly strong. It's like almost a semi-giant version of Mr. Spock, with Mr. Spock's strength, every bit as much skill and training, but no restraint and no morality. And in a callback to that earlier fanfiction, Omni wants not only to own James, but to break him physically. And he does. And we see almost all of it. And it would never, ever be allowed in Star Trek fiction now. Never. Never. Omni's goal in those scenes is not just to make sure that James knows who's boss, but also to break James to the point where he weeps like a baby. And he does, and we see all that. And something in the reader breaks then too. You're thinking, well, okay, you've been reborn naked in an impregnable fortress at the hands of a madman who's much stronger than you are. Naturally, you're going to lose, and if he's vicious, maybe you'll beg for mercy or at least cry out in pain. But it's more than that. And when we see that, we think, well, at least I thought when I read this 50 years ago, I thought, that's awful. That I've seen that in fan fiction, but with fan fiction without Star Trek on the spine, I never had to take it seriously. That I remember thinking that would never happen. There isn't anything you could do, physically or otherwise, that would break Jim Kirk. That's why he's Jim Kirk. I don't want to reveal too much about the book in case you're, for some odd reason, intrigued to read it. I don't know where you would find a copy. The Price of the Phoenix had this great cover when it originally came out. This is an original paperback, and then it was gone for a long time, and then it was given a weird reprint with a weird cover. That preserved only one detail correctly. There was one thing I liked about that weird new cover. That's probably the cover you would find if you found this used, is that we don't see what Omni looks like. Sandra Marshak and Myrna Calbreth refer to his heathen idol face, but they go out of their way to make sure that they don't ever call him Black. His nickname is Black Omni, but they don't ever say what his skin texture looks like. I think, purposely skirt around making him, a giant black supervillain of like from a blaxploitation movie that were popular at this time. And the new cover likewise doesn't show us Omni. It shows us him in silhouette from behind. But one way or another, I don't want to spoil too much of the book. But of course, you already know, it turns out that in addition to James, who is a completely perfect duplicate of Jim Kirk was also saved by a conventional transporter. So Omni has two bargaining chips to control Spock and the Romulan Commander. He has demonstrated to them a device that could topple any government. As he points out, what president wouldn't want a wife back, a treasured son back? Not just an android duplicate of some kind or other, but themselves back again. What autonomous leader of any empire or world wouldn't himself want to survive death? And who wouldn't sell out to Omni if that was on the table, if that was offered? And the book is wonderful. It's so cheesy. It's so cheesy. It would never be allowed to be written today, but it is wonderful. The Romulan Commander is a fantastic character in here. She takes no guff from anybody, and in a wonderful turn, she falls in love with James, not Jim Kirk, and not Spock, but James, who immediately starts developing experiences of his own, and immediately stops being just a carbon copy of Jim Kirk, and doesn't know what to think when Jim Kirk is revealed. What does that make him? Totally cut off from any kind of life. Can't be captain of the Enterprise, even though that's how he thinks of himself, because the captain of the Enterprise isn't dead. Can't go into the Federation. His face is known everywhere. The book shapes up to be a confrontation between the Romulan Commander and Jim Kirk and James and Spock on one side and Omni on the other. And it's terrific. It has dramatic high points like you wouldn't believe, and it addresses the question of irreplaceability. What makes a person a person? What makes a person lovable, able to be loved, and able to love? What makes them something other than property? It's an idea that Star Trek flirted with many times in the original series, where duplicates were not exactly unknown. But here it's done just searchingly, right down to the bottom, and right up to the great climax scene, where everybody's all together. They're all gathered together in the climax of the end. I won't reveal any of the details because there are some truly cliffhanger moments. But they have a conversation when all of it is all over and done, and it looks like Omni is going to win completely. And he has made it clear to them that the final frontier is death, and I have conquered it. What are you going to do about that? The Romulan Commander says, we would give anything for it, except what we are. And Omni says, so say you all, Omni said, and his eyes were darkly impressed as he felt the weight of common assent, like a solid unity among them. Even McCoy lifted his head and met the black eyes with a searing look of loathing and icy, bleak pride. He who had fought death on his own ground, and too often lost, and would fight again. Omni nodded. So you will not, after all, quite sell soul, flag, fortune, and sacred honor. We will not sell what makes love possible, said the commander. But that is the price of the Phoenix, said Omni. In other words, the irreplaceability of the thing loved is what makes love possible, and that is what the Phoenix the Phoenix process completely undercuts. And this book ends in a cliffhanger. Sandra Marshak and Milner Galbraith could not bring themselves to kill the character who had defeated death, no matter what it looks like. It ends in a great cliffhanger. So when you read this book in 1976 or 7 or whenever this came out, you really wanted more. You really wanted Omni to return. This book, in addition to, like all of those original seasons of Star Trek, spawned a massive amount of fan fiction about Omni, his past, his future encounters. One of the complaints that Star Trek fans made about this book that I actually share is that there are no Klingons in it. We've met noble Klingons. Kang was a noble Klingon. He's just as noble in his own way as the Romulan Commander. Why is he not in here? I think it was just that fan fiction loved the Romulans, never could get enough of them. Maybe Sandra Marshak and Milner Galbraith thought having a Klingon would make things more complicated. I don't really know. I wish that Kang were in here, because the way they deal with him in the Procrustean Petard is really good. But there's one thing these two knew, it was how to listen to fans. Unlike today, where a lot of Star Trek writers are just taking a brief. They might love Star Trek. They might say they love Star Trek one way or another. They're not. They might meet fans at a convention. But these two, this was a different era. When they had published in Star Trek New Voyages 1 and 2, their post office box. You could write to them. You didn't have to send them a manuscript. You could write anything you want. They wanted to hear from fans. And they listened. And they made a sequel, The Fate of the Phoenix, which brings everybody back together. James and the Romulan Commander, that is the original cover. As you can tell, he has been fitted out as a Romulan. In a bleak kind of compromise with reality, the Romulan Commander thinks maybe I can make a life for you in the Romulan Star Empire. Possibly. Not 100% sure. It might not work, but you can't be captain of the Enterprise, and we love each other, so maybe. And this brings everybody back together, and it's amazingly good. There's one more Phoenix process duplication in this book. One unthinkable Phoenix process duplication. And there's also Omni, who returns, and it's just fantastic. It's twice as long as the original, and just also ends on an undecided note. There could easily be a third book. There never will be. I am now reconciled to the fact, since it has now been 50 years, I am reconciled to the fact that there will never be a Return of the Phoenix. There will never be a third book called that. I might write it. Plenty of other people have written it. But these two, I don't think will write it. So, so these are our Boldly Govember books for today. The Price of the Phoenix and The Fate of the Phoenix, which I love so dearly. I have memorized huge chunks of them. Like, for instance, the climax of The Price of the Phoenix has to be physical. It's the kind of villain Omni is. It has to be physical. It's technological as well. There were many people who read this book and thought, surely Scotty should have had a more prominent role in this book than he did. A lot of Omni's upper hands are technological, and Omni is not a better engineer than Scott. But nevertheless, you know before you're 30 pages into this book that the climax is going to be physical, and you kind of sort of know what it is. It's not going to be Omni breaking James Kirk. It's going to be Omni fighting Spock in hand-to-hand combat, and that's what happens, and oh my god. Oh my god. Our authors deliver. It has been boiling throughout this book. The one thing you can do to Spock to enrage him, to make him throw off the veneer of Vulcan logic and simply be the kind of berserker maniac that the Vulcans were before they embraced logic, is to threaten James Kirk. And that's what Omni has done not only once but twice in the most fundamental way possible. And Spock's temper is building throughout this book, straining the limits of his control throughout this book. And when it finally breaks out, when there is finally the scene where Spock and Omni square off and fight each other, oh, I still love it. Even after all this time, even knowing how hokey it is, I love it. So there you go. Those are our Star Trek books for today. The Price of the Phoenix and The Fate of the Phoenix. They're classic, old Star Trek fiction right on the cusp of changing forever. Right on the cusp of the studio and its lawyers getting involved to see, well, what is this? This is representing our property. If this is going to be a movie in the theaters, then you can't write whatever you want. Maybe we should have a guidebook of some kind. Maybe one of us should see your manuscript before it goes all the way through the editing process. Maybe we should look into that. These were some of the last books before that started happening. And they're glorious. They're glorious cheese, but they're glorious. So those are our Star Trek books for today. And we will move on from here. Tomorrow we will be moving further and further into the light of Star Trek stopping from being a fan phenomenon and starting to be a commercial property. Well, all the good and bad that entails. You can see some of the good and bad right away. You will lose some of this rough and woolly Wild West energy, but you will have a steady stream of Star Trek novels where you didn't before. So there's a price to be paid. We'll talk more about it. For the two of you who find this interesting, we'll talk more about it tomorrow. I will hope. I missed a day. I'm hoping I don't miss many more days. It's not like missing days. I like talking to you. So I'll wrap this up. That is our Boldly Govember for today. Matt Paperback Junkie is not doing a Star Trek novel every day. I don't expect anyone else to. But if you have a BookTube channel and you've read Star Trek and really liked it, feel free to make a video. I haven't seen as many response videos to Boldly Govember as I would like, considering how many of you, I'm sure, are Star Trek fans. But one way or another, you're not getting rid of me, even if you don't make videos. So I'll be back with more Star Trek palaver tomorrow. I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.